great event. Today, in the last session, we have two wonderful presenters. The first, we have beer. The first is beer, and the second is Yaron, right? So, please.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for having us in the program. Thank you, ECGI, Lady Suzanne, thank you. And our hosting institution, thank you so much. Wonderful conference. So the bright side of common ownership, is there a bright side to common ownership? This is a work in progress together with Miguel, Anton, Martin, and Florian, Ederer. And I'm really pleased to present it to you guys. It's still work in progress. I'm really keen on all your insights, especially from the law crowd, which I get very few opportunities to hear your poignant points. So this paper is set between two big macro trends regarding the competitiveness debate of the US economy. The first one is increasing in product market concentration that goes hand in hand with higher profits, lower corporation dynamism, and declining corporate innovation. And the second one is increasing common ownership to the extent that large shareholders in firm I have positions in firm J. So what we ask is, does corporate innovation depend on common ownership? And if at all, can common ownership have pro-competitive and welfare-enhancing effects? And we tackle this question first through the theory, and the theory is going to say, well, potentially, it's going to depend between two dimensions with regards to innovation. The first dimension is going to be that common ownership of competitors may reduce the incentives to steal business from them, but there's another dimension. There are technological spillovers, and those technological spillovers, depending on how strong they are, they may actually incent further innovation. And then we go from the theory, we take it into the data and see, well, do we have, in fact, both results, both effects, and which one prevails in the data? Okay, so here, yes, we are all very aware that over the last 20 years, institutional ownership has changed dramatically. Why do I show you this? Not because it's a Martin paper, but because there has been a large debate of how are we going to be measuring common ownership. And it started with the modified Herfindahl index. It then went to other less model-driven measures, such as top 5 shareholders, what are their positions in other firms. And it seems that the finance and the econ literature, and in particular the IO literature, is focusing on the kappas. And what are the kappas? So kappa, the core measure is going to be kappa ij, yeah, between two firms. So it's the weight that we put, that firm I puts on profit j's. This kappa is going to depend both on ownership and control, and what we observe here is this aggregated through the economy. So it has gone up from 0.4% to 0.70%. So this is a dramatic effect of putting weight onto other firms out in the economy. Common ownership, though, it's not just within the bounds of competitors, so that was a very natural way of starting of this literature, but it can go beyond competitors into other firms. And here we have Apple, IBM, Motorola, and Intel, all of them doing a massive amount of R&D and having patents. And the question is, how are they connected from an innovation perspective? And they are connected through technological spillover. So as Apple innovates, Apple cannot capture the full effect of its innovation as it opens the eyes to technologically closed firms on things that they could actually do. Yeah? So IBM benefits, Motorola and Intel, they benefit. And Apple cannot capture the full effect. So, Apple is not going to invest as much in innovation as it should optimally do. But at the same time, Apple competes with IBM in the product market space, in the PC space, while Motorola competes with Intel in the chip space. So Apple has an incentive to innovate and to steal market from IBM. How do these technological and product market spillovers look like? Well, when we take it into the data, and here we have a lot of numbers, but essentially, if you look into the red lines, product market, you see, yes. So here we have Apple. So Apple has no product market relationship with Intel, but of 0.47% technologically spillover connection here. Whereas, for example, Apple with IBM the red 1.65 product market spillover with IBM, and as well a very strong technological spillover with IBM. Okay, so when we look into the data, we have this complex network of innovation ties through spillovers. Now, what is the effect of common ownership with vis-a-vis these spillovers? Well, the first effect is that common ownership can help overcome this free rider effect on the technological spillovers. And the fact that these other firms that are connected to you technologically are going to benefit. Well, if you put some weight into them, don't care that much, so that would spur innovation. Okay, so this is the first channel. And the second channel, common ownership, will reduce the incentives to steal market share. So that level of innovation that you wanted to do it in the first place now is going to be disincented, but through the channel of common ownership. Okay, so we have these two effects, and in the past, most of the literature has focused on the anti-competitive effects, whereas here we have these two, an anti-competitive effect going through the product market and a potentially pro-competitive effect going through the technological spillovers. So let's go into the theory and see what the theory gives us, a little bit more of color on these relationships. And what we built is an oligopolistic model where we have n firms, all of them competing with each other. And these n firms are differentiated at the product market. Their differentiation is going to depend on alpha AJ, okay? So this is a product homogeneity. The higher this alpha AJ, the closer it is to 1, the stronger my incentive to steal business from my competitor. How do we model innovation? It's a costly investment that reduces the marginal cost of the corporation. And here we find the technological spillovers. So the higher the technological spillovers between two corporations, then I'm going to benefit more as this other corporation is going to do innovation. It's going to be lowering my marginal cost. And finally, we have owners that are diversified. So an owner in firm I has as well stakes in firm J. And we assume here that firms maximize shareholder value. It's just an assumption. If firms maximize shareholder value, then firms maximize this function here, which is a weighted average of the firm I plus other firms J weighted by these kappas. Okay, and then these kappas can have different levels of weights. Okay, so the greater weight attached to other profits is going to depend on precisely this kappa. More about this model. So if we look into the inverse demand function here, you notice that we have the alphas, and therefore this product proximity, as other competitors increase quantities, right, it's going to force us to lower prices, right? So you see here the tension of the product market competition. And with regards to the marginal cost depends on a parameter, C bar, minus the investment in innovation, minus beta, here, our technological spillovers, and multiplied by the investment of other firms J in innovation. Yeah? So the higher the innovation of firm J, it's going to lower my marginal cost. With regards to common ownership, how is common ownership measured? This is the classic construct. And essentially what we see here in the numerator is the combination of gamma I, which is control, times ownership shares in other firms, right? So if we take this, for example, to, if we combine Facebook with Google, right? We're going to have one controlling, large one shareholder, Zuckerberg, right? Who's going to have a lot of control, yeah? And potentially very low positions in other firms, right? So essentially this kappa between Facebook and Apple is going to be very, very low compared to kappas between, let's say, two airline corporations where you're going to have that control and ownership is diversified across different shareholders. These kappas are going to capture ownership within industries and across industries. And again, in this setup, because technological spillovers move across industries, it's very important just to get away with this industry component or definition. All right, so when we run the first order conditions, we observe here the two distinct effects of the model. The first one is that common ownership only has an impact on innovation through the spillovers. Only through the spillovers. This is what the model delivers. So for an increase in common ownership, and this is the first effect, when you interact with product market spillovers, so the higher the alpha JI, yeah, the more it's going to impact quantities negatively, and that is going to feed into innovation. So common ownership increases. This is the anti-competitive effect. Yeah. So common ownership increases. It reduces incentives to compete. It's going to reduce quantities, and through the quantitative channel, it's going to reduce innovation. Now, the direct effect is going to be coming from the technological spillovers. As common ownership increases, we benefit more from these technology spillovers by other firms, and it goes directly to XI innovation. So we have these two effects. Okay, so in a sense, product market spillovers, we have here that as common ownership increases, it will discourage innovation, versus this other dimension, as common ownership increases, it will encourage innovation. The model sort of gives us, yes, an equilibrium level of innovation, but what's most telling to bring this to the empirics is the effect of innovation vis-a-vis, yeah, the different spillovers, alpha and beta. So the effect of common ownership on innovation is going to be decreasing relative to the product market spillovers, and it's going to be increasing with respect to the technological spillovers. And that's precisely what we're going to bring into the data. We're going to see, okay, you know, is this what we observe from the data? So the innovation data, we use input innovation, and that's going to be focused on R&D expenditures, getting this data from CompuStat, and then output innovation. And for output innovation, we're going to be using citation-weighted value of patents, which is going to measure the scientific impact of those patents. These are forward-looking measures, as well as market value of patents. Okay, and the market value of patents tries to capture precisely the impact in the market, the impact in pricing as you as you disclose a patent, sort of captures the 3-day window around those patent announcements. And we have data from 85 to 2015. Now the spillover measures. And these spillover measures, they come from the econometrica paper of Bloom, Shankerman, and Van Rienen. And how do we measure product market spillovers? It's going to have two components. The first component is going to be this SIC, yeah, which is the correlation. We have two firms, and these two firms have products in different industries. So it's going to be the correlation between these two vectors of in the product market space, yeah? How correlated these two. And this is going to be weighted by G, yeah, the stock of R&D. Technological spillovers, which are knowledge spillovers, is going to be in a similar fashion. And now the tech between the spillover between these two firms is going to depend on tech times the stock of R&D, and tech being, again, the correlation between these two vectors, and being here the patents. Yeah? So how correlated are the patents between these two firms? How close? So we can think of this, and we are going to, these correlations as well are like distance measures, right? So we're going to use different distance measures, the Jaffe and the Mahalanobis distance measures. Okay. With regards to the ownership data, we use the 13F, extended and improved. We've worked very thoroughly on this data. And then our measures of common ownership are indeed the kappas. And here the kappas are going to be equally or value weighted and at the firm level. So yes, very important at the firm level, meaning that yeah, the core measure is between two firms. So we're going to aggregate between all the firms in the universe. Here we don't have industries, we have a full economy. All right. So what type of models do we use in the empirics? We take a standard innovation model and we extend it with common ownership and the interactive effects of common ownership and the different spillovers. And from the theory, what we are interested is in these two parameters, in alpha 4, so the interaction of common ownership and still sick, which should be negative according to the theory, and alpha 5, interaction between common ownership and still sick, which should be positive according to the theory. All specifications, so this is standard OLES. All specifications include all fixed effects, year, industry, and firm fixed effects. And this is the first set of results, and I would like for us to focus first on column 3 and 4, and on the second line, which gives us a sense of gives us the sign and the magnitude of the interaction effect, common ownership with spill tech. And indeed, it's positive. Yeah, we see it's positive in this, according to the Jaffe measures of distance, as well as the Mahalanobis measure of distance. With regards to common ownership and still sick, it's negative. Yeah. But when we put, so the question now is, yes, we can identify that there are these two effects present in the data, yeah, these two spillover effects, and when there is an interaction, they actually present the sign that the theory tells us that they should have. But when we aggregate these two effects, what is the net effect? And the net effect here in column 2, yeah, it's negative. However, thank you. However, when we put all, when we look into the economic significance of that, moving from the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile, it really decreases R&D expenditures by very, very little, so 0.15%. So yes, it's negative, but economically it's not very relevant. So how does the analysis look like for output measures of innovation, citation-weighted patents? So we observe as well the same signs. So positive signs for the interaction with technological spillovers, negative with product market spillovers, and the net effect being here 0, no effect. Okay. And for market value of patents, what we observe here, it's only an effect, a positive effect of on the technological spillovers, and no effect on product market. So these two effects, yeah, and for the inputs and for the citation weighted, we saw that the net effect is very close to 0, and that masks a potential a lot of heterogeneity across the distribution. So what do we do here? We look into a change for every firm, a change from the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile in common ownership, and we apply the parameters that our econometrics gives us, and then we see what is the impact on citation-weighted patents. And of course, we see that, hey, the distributions gives us that there nearly half of our sample has a positive effect, and the other half of the sample has a negative effect overall. Yeah? So here we observe that these two effects, have a very, very strong. That those two effects are present, but in the aggregate, they do cancel. They do seem to cancel out. And I'm sure that in the last few minutes, I would like to talk a little bit about the mechanism, and I'm sure some of you are thinking, okay, how is this possible? And especially Emiliano, always gives me a hard time with mechanisms. So, in a similar vein from our other paper on incentives, these results, they do not assume or imply any active intervention of common owners. It is really through the pressure on managerial effort. And here what we are claiming is that as you have firms that are more commonly owned, you reduce shareholder pressure or incentives to innovate. Firms will innovate less. Why so? Well, you're going to put less pressure in equilibrium, all things taken into account, in equilibrium, less pressure because cost reductions would hurt the product market of your competitors in the same portfolio. So these are things that are set at the same time. Okay? In terms of the technological spillovers, if we think that patenting and protecting, your knowledge as well takes effort, if you take a more passive way of reducing that protection, then those spillovers are gonna take place. So a less incentivized owner may not have patented a technology and would have, allowed for benefiting from this knowledge beforehand than through strong protection of knowledge. Okay, so, yes, so what we propose here is really a very passive mechanism of eliminating this strong pressure to protect knowledge, yeah, or strong pressure to compete fiercely with your competitors. So if you dial that down, then you will see this effect. So, in a nutshell, what does this paper attempt to do? Well, first of all, think about, in an organized fashion, how common ownership could have an impact through a very important corporate decision, that is innovation, that requires to think about innovation in these two dimensions. Prior literature has only taken mostly into account the technological spillover channel and disregarded the product market channel. So putting these two dimensions together give us, so far with this is preliminary work, gives us a sense that, hey, if you look into the aggregate, it seems that not much is going on, but we have to look into the different channels. And a message to, from a policy maker perspective is, we should be extremely careful doing, any policy on aggregate results before really understanding what is the underneath distributional effects. Thank you very much.
Great one. Okay. All right. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to discuss this paper. As you will see later, I'm a last-minute addition to the conference. So I'm quite excited to be here, and you also see the issues I'm facing when I'm discussing this paper. Okay. Depending my discussion. So I think Mireia did a great job of presenting the paper. We are looking at this graph. I think we're looking at the same graph, which is that the cross-ownership pattern is on an increasing trend, right? And this graph starts in 1980, so it just goes up, right? There is some breaks, but it's practically just a rising number coming from 0.2 in the 80s to now 0.7, 0.8 in the recent years. So the question is, what is the effect of this common ownership on various, what I think of welfare issues, right? We're not talking about firm-specific outcomes anymore. Now we are talking about welfare. How does this affect consumers? How does this affect the economy as a whole? How does this affect society? So when we are asking those questions, we need to think about innovation. We need to think about consumers. And as I will say later, we also have to think about environment. Because as we try to take as much as possible from each other, we also may be taking away from the environment. Okay. So this is the graph, the table that Yaron showed, that Mireia showed. This is paper in a slide, in the sense that this graph tells you everything you need to know about the paper, basically. And you see the black and the red lines here. The black lines is about technology spillover, and the red lines is about product market spillovers, right? So it's clear that there's a lot of technology spillovers, but there's only a little bit of product market spillovers, right? So not everybody operating in the same space is competing with each other. Okay? So that's the point. That's where the identification is supposed to come from in this paper. Now, before I talk about identification, let me set out the important ingredients for this analysis. So the idea here is that we're going to look at common ownership, and we will look at innovation, and we're going to try to look at the correlation between the two. Okay? And that, to some extent, begs the question of what are the potential modifiers here. And the two modifiers that we're discussing is again, going back to technology and product market spillover. Right? So the results are clear. Where you have the black lines, the innovation has a certain correlation with common ownership, and when you see red lines, innovation has a different correlation with common ownership. So in some ways, you see the black line, you see the red line, and they're different. They have different effects. Now, I also would like to point out one important ingredient here, which is the orange ovals there. And the orange ovals basically reflect this common ownership, right? And the common ownership here are pretty much, if you look at these tables, you're looking at the big three. You're looking at Vanguard, you're looking at BlackRock, and you're looking at State Street. Okay? So I'm highlighting BlackRock and Vanguard. State Street is almost everywhere as well. And to some extent, this goes back to Jennifer's discussion yesterday, about this, passive owners are everywhere now. 20%, if you just sum up the three numbers, is about 20% of every firm in the US is owned by this big three. So now the question that I have in mind is, what is driving the variation here? Right? Because the variation here is not obvious that there are variations across these four firms here in the graph. They are all connected by these 20% gross ownerships. Okay? So are these owners, as I think Mireia explained at the very end of her presentation, are they just sitting back and allowing managers to do what is best for themselves, not for the shareholders, but for themselves? Or, in the words I read, rationally reticent, or are they doing something? It's not obvious to me. Now, I think this paper that you're seeing here is probably would have been the best paper to introduce the concept of common ownership. I wish this is the first paper that Martin did in this topic, right? Because if that's the case, then we can talk about positive welfare effect. Right? We can introduce innovation through common ownership, but it is not, right? So now we have to worry about the product market competition. I also want to talk about whether we're thinking about the cross-sectional variation, or we're talking about the time series variation. Because the time series variation is one where, as you see the graph just now, increasing in terms of common ownership, do we also see an increase in innovation? Now, there's a lot of discussion about market power, and market power apparently has reduced innovation. Can common ownership, to some extent, reduce that effect, mitigate that effect? It's not obvious to me. I think that's also an important consideration. The paper, as it stands right now, is mostly about cross-sectional variation. And as I described, it's not obvious to me where the cross-sectional variation is coming from. I'm going to drill down into the variable. And as I do that, I'm going to talk about the theory a little bit. So I'm going to bore you again with theory. Eric will be very excited, right? There are many Greeks here, fewer than 20, but I will talk about some Greeks in a second. And the last thing I want to mention is that in this next slide, right? So the summary is, I think the results are obvious if you actually read the theory. The theory is very clear. The predictions for the theory are quite clear. When you worry a lot about free riding, right? Common ownership can reduce the free riding concerns and can increase innovation. But then you worry about business stealing, and if you worry about business stealing, then common ownership can actually help with this innovation, right? So common ownership will be innovation when you see a strong technological spillover or when you see weak business stealing effects. So the empirical results are very clear. I'm not going to talk too much about empirical results. I think it was very clear from the presentation. So what I want to talk about is whether or not I'm qualified to actually discuss this paper, right? I'm not an expert. My focus of research is looking at institutional investors, geographical factors, and some sustainability topics. I'm not an expert in innovation or product market competition, right? So I cannot even talk about the welfare effect because I'm not an expert. But fortunately for me, very fortunately for me, is I'm currently supervising a student who is working actively in common ownership, and I had to read his proposal right before I was asked to discuss his paper. So when I saw the paper, I can actually understand the model because I'm familiar with all the Greeks that showed up in this paper, right? So I'm learning from him actually. I actually asked him to read the paper and tell me what's going on, right? So he's writing a job market paper, and his job market paper is actually quite similar to what you're doing in the innovation space. he's thinking of it from the environment space. And if I have time, I'll talk a bit more about his paper, because I think his paper will give you some ideas in terms of how to potentially strengthen your arguments here in this paper. Okay, so the focus on the discussion will be on kappa. But kappa is the profit share that I'm sharing with another firm because we have common owners. Okay, now kappa is typically an IJ thing. Right? There's a firm I and firm J. But in this paper, as you will see later, kappa is actually being aggregated at the firm level to something that is called COI, or kappa I. Kappa I is the average of firm I's kappa with all other firms in the economy. Okay, so let's take a step and pause there, right? Because this is no longer a pairwise variable, it's a firm level variable. Okay? Now, what is this? Well, it starts with a pairwise kappa, which is kappa ij, and kappa ij basically looks like this. Not going to talk about the Greeks. So the important ingredient here is this, which is that at the end of the day, kappa ij, let's call it, this is fg here, but if it's ij, then it's beta I times beta j, right? So it's how much firm I is owned by shareholder S and how much of firm J is owned by shareholder S. And if the numerator is high, then that means between firm I and firm J, there are a lot of common owners. Okay? But there's another component of this variable, which is at the bottom. You have beta FS, which is beta I. Now, what is that? That's basically the ownership concentration of firm F, or firm I. Right? So firm I's ownership concentration, how much of ownership of firm I is concentrated. So here in Korea, presumably that number is quite high. Okay? And in the US, the number should be quite low, except for the fact that we are seeing this rising ownership by the big three. Okay? But it's more than that, right? Because there are many firms for which ownership concentration could be high without the big three. You can imagine a family firm. You can imagine Facebook is a good example of this, right? So beta, the denominator could be high, even when there is not a lot of cross ownership. So a high kappa could be because the numerator is high or the denominator is low. Okay, so that's something that I think I would explore the authors to think harder a bit about this issue. Okay, so this is actually, I'm stealing this from another paper, obviously, and I'm assuming you know which paper I'm stealing from. So there's an issue here, which is that there is a relative Herfindahl index, and this is about ownership concentration of firm I. And from this other paper that I'm stealing, you can see that parts of the variation of kappa is coming from the numerator, and part is coming from the denominator, which is the ownership concentration. So I think this is to be controlled for in the regression, and potentially when you're thinking about the model, maybe the model can spit out something that is more directly related to the numerator instead of the denominator. Because that's your focus, right? So you can try to think about just completely removing the denominator and just focus on the numerator. This is the C index. So Michel Laurie's paper is about the C index rather than thinking about kappa. So it's a slightly different measure, but I think it captures what you want to capture better than kappa to some extent. Okay. So I'm going to skip this because this is exactly the problem, right? So part of the reason is the denominator could be high for other reasons unrelated to institutional ownership, and I think Martin's paper actually look at this to some extent, looking at the 13D and 13G, so kappa is measured slightly differently, right? The other alternative is to, rather than looking at the kappa measure, you may also look as a dummy of how active are the cross owners in the particular firm, right? So you can think of it as maybe just a dummy of low and high, rather than looking at the actual value, because the actual value could be driven by the denominator rather than the numerator. Okay. Now, I want to talk a bit more about research design because I think this is the heart of the paper. So this is the prediction of the model, right? The current test is basically looking at the interaction. Common ownership increases innovation when the technological spillover effect is strong. So the variable is calculated, each variable, common ownership and spillover, each is calculated at the firm level, okay? Which means that the variable of interest in the regression is this interaction variable, CO cross spill tech, okay? But this is COI interacted with spill tech I. Both are basically averages at a firm level. Now, this is not what the model actually is spitting out. The model prediction is not about averages at a firm level. The model prediction is about the pair level, IJ, COIJ multiplied by spill tech IJ. How much do two firms being cross-owned by the same owner, okay? And how much do they have technology spillover, okay? So, in fact, this is the definition of the variables, right? I'm not going to talk too much about it. The point is that it's all about spill tech I, right? Not IJ, because the authors never actually interact tech IJ and COIJ. Okay? What we want is this measure. How much do we have technology spillover among firms in the same ownership network? So we need the IJ, basically, in everything that we do, right? So this is my proposed measure. Rather than looking at just tech IJ multiplied by GJT, which is the amount of R&D that the firm J is doing, I think you need the kappa IJ in that measure. And then you do the sum over these pairwise measures, right? So I think this is the variable you want in the regression rather than the other than this variable here. Okay. So why do I say that? So this is what the model is actually saying. The model is saying in the model, and sorry for all the the betas and the kappas. We want beta 1, 2 multiplied by kappa 1, 2. Firm 1 and firm 2, firm 1 and firm 2. And actually, I learned something. I took matrix algebra, but I didn't realize that we have this. We have this thing that I'm not familiar with, which is this operator here. This is the Hadamard operator, which is a Hadamard product. It's element by element product. And I was surprised that I don't remember seeing that in my matrix algebra. I must have failed matrix algebra maybe 25 years ago. So. But this is actually the important ingredient in the model, which I hope that it can be translated into the empirical analysis. Okay? And I think this is the heart of the paper, and I really want to see what is the actual parameter estimate coming out from the empirical analysis if you had used this variable. Okay? The same. So you can actually use your current measure as a control variable because this, at the firm level, the average is the firm level, is saying something about industry characteristics. Firm I is operating in a particular industry where there's a lot of technology spillover, right? And that's fine. If you want to control for that, you may want to say something about that. But this is different from technology spillover in the same common ownership network. Those are two different things. And what you want is the latter, not the former, right? The same issue, I think, arises with the product market spillover. I will actually encourage you to think about this multiplying the IJ earlier rather than as a firm level averages. I'm clearly running out of time, right? The last point I want to make here is that when you're looking at the product market spillover, you may want to think about other measure of product market similarity of two firms. And you can use, let's say, the Holberg and Phillips product similarity measure. So that may be a useful way to do this rather than just thinking about the SIC level similarity. Okay. You can also, the other thing is that right now you have this interaction term. I think you need to control for interaction term of CO with a lot of other things because your interest is in the interaction terms. Then that means you have to control at the interaction level rather than at the standalone firm level characteristics. Okay? I also feel that you're missing a lot of control variables, because in general, this is a section about control variables, literally one paragraph. I think you want more like this. I don't know what, just telling you as a referee, I would say, I want more, right? Okay. So the last thing I want to bring up is, I have 2 minutes. The last thing I want to bring up is actually something that George is my student, and he keeps on telling me that, you know, the paper is great. I said, okay, but what makes the paper great? It's like, oh, they're doing from pair analysis. I'm like, no, that's not what they're doing. And then he looked and said, oh yeah, I think you can do a lot more with the firm pair analysis. You can do a lot more with the firm pair analysis because, so for example, you can think about whether the two firms are citing each other's patterns, right? There's an IJ level of innovation that you can do, because right now the outcome variable is at the innovation at firm I level, but you can actually think about how much innovation spillover is actually happening between firms in the same ownership network, right? That's the idea here. He knows this paper better than I do. I mean, he read it twice and he told me that, you know, I'm not doing a good job discussing the paper, right? So okay, so hand it to him, right? He also came up with this idea that maybe you can run this firm pair regression of partnership formation, for example, joint venture among the cross-ownership network. Now, I push back at this idea because I said, look, there's not a lot of joint ventures in the US, but I don't know this. I mean, again, I'm not an expert, so I'm just telling you what my prior, so maybe you can think about, are there a lot of joint ventures between firms in the US that you can actually systematically record, right? It's not obvious to me. It's an interesting work, part of very important debate, I think, at the moment. I would like to see more direct channels between cross-ownerships and innovation at the firm pair level, right, the spillover. Is there any evidence of joint decisions between firm I and firm J? Then that's something that I think Josh had some idea about. Right, so you can think about whether or not firm I is innovating specifically in the tech or industries in which it has a lot of spillovers with other firms. So one thing that I was a bit surprised is to see this paper, because I didn't realize that how correlated this paper are with yours, but there's a common ownership and innovation efficiency, and I thought this is relevant for you. It's a recent JFE paper. My reading is that it is different from your paper, but you may want to read this carefully just to make sure that there's not much overlap. So George actually, his job market paper is literally thinking about this firm I and firm J, and this is a shameless promotion for his job market paper. He's looking at whether or not firm I is polluting in the region in which the firm I has less cross-ownership with other firms in that region, right? And what he finds is actually when firm I is operating a facility in a location within which firm I has a lot of cross-ownership with other firms in the area, pollution goes away from that area, moves to some other area in which firm I doesn't have a lot of cross-ownership with the region. Okay? So he actually finds that there's a within firm variation in pollution based on cross-ownership. Is this a positive welfare effect or negative welfare effect? To me, that's a zero welfare effect because it's just shifting from one region to another region. Now, of course, in the US, you know that all regions are the same, so this has a distributional effect. And I think to some extent what you're finding is also distributional effect. And maybe that's one way to pitch the paper, is that this is all about distribution. Innovations may happen in an industry and not in others. And I think that's a great contribution to the literature. I think that's it. Thank you.
You can make that assumption, then you can actually simplify the kappas between alignment and concentration. So the variation will come, and this is very intuitive. If your shareholders have very similar portfolios, then you're going to see variation in common ownership as those portfolios change. And as well, you're going to see variation as concentration changes vis-a-vis the other firms. So these are like two sources of variation. Your central point is extremely well taken. How do we match the model to the empirics? And you're absolutely right that what we should be doing is interact first and then aggregate, which is what we are actually doing in this new version of the paper. So, thanks for the comment, and it's very, very well identified. Then product market similarity, yes, we should be looking beyond industry, classic industry classifications and going into the Hover Phillips, absolutely. On the variables, on adding additional variables to the model, I think that here I would like to have a longer conversation because it's not obvious what additional variables. We want to make it a very clean and not get into kitchen sink type of models. So we just borrowed a very robust model out there in the econ literature on innovation and then extended with the only variables that are required. But of course, this is just OLS, so I'm hoping that the audience will give us a few pointers to what possible identification strategies, which we have done in other papers of common ownership, but here, because we don't have industries, it's really hard to come up with a clever identification strategy. And yes, as well, the comment on looking at pairwise implications. So we could look into citation between common owners, between the pairs. Thank you so much. Excellent.
Thank you very much. So first, any question? Response?
Yes. So I guess this goes to the mechanism question. I mean, the paper assumes that with common ownership, that the managers are going to engage in less innovation than, or a different level of innovation than if there wasn't common ownership. And it seems like your mechanism is managerial effort. I guess at two levels I wonder about that. One is even in terms of, even if managers were operating in a world with very little shareholder pressure, it seems to me they have significant incentives to innovate because that produces residuals that they have some opportunity to work with that are utility useful to them. But even if you don't accept that, if we're thinking about what are the pressures that push managers to share value maximize, I don't see how the big three, the presence of the big three ownership really changes that. It doesn't change share price compensation. It's difficult to tell a story as to how it changes what an activist, the threat of an activist campaign, and it presumably doesn't change whatever monitoring comes from independent board members.
Okay, Harry?
So great paper. I really enjoyed it. I want to push you guys on a theory point and then see if I can parlay that into maybe some flailing hint on an identification strategy. But it'll be super flailing because I'm jet lagged. So the theory point is this. So once upon a time, I worked in an IP litigation firm and I was thinking about IP. I don't that much anymore, but there are sort of at least two versions of theoretical constructs about innovation games. And one of them is a cost reduction game. And that's kind of what you guys are modeling here, right? And that competitive markets, I don't really kind of take account of the fact that there might be spillovers when I'm thinking about innovating for my own marginal cost reductions. I don't really care about Merit that much. But if I have some cross ownership, I may care about him a little bit more, and therefore I'll invest more. So competition sort of stifles innovation, and common ownership would sort of encourage it. There's another branch of this literature that I guess I would trace back to Harrison, Vickers, and Fudenberg, which are patent race games. All right. Now these are games in which you can actually get not only too much, but way too much effort in innovation in competitive markets, because you're not really reducing costs. What you're doing is you're opening up a new product market, right? In some brand new in product space, some brand new hoteling sidewalk, and I get to own 20 straight blocks of it, right? And keep Martin from occupying any of it. And there, competition can give rise to way too much innovation, because not only do I end up sort of realizing the value of my new innovation on the margin, but I get to steal all of his rents while I'm doing that, all right? And so that type of a model, I think, would probably predict exactly the opposite, right? That as you, that in fact common ownership could actually help things, but it would help things by reducing the aggregate amount of information, of innovation, rather than increasing the aggregate amount of innovation. And both of those are pretty well pedigreed models of innovation in the IO literature. So I'm interested in that dialogue in theory space. And maybe as a way to adjudicate this, and this is the flailing part, is that I think kind of right smack in the middle of a bunch of the data that you guys are analyzing, there was a lot of action that was going on in patent law. It became, in a series of cases starting in 2012 and 2014, way harder to patent various types of things that the Supreme Court just decided were laws of nature or were too obvious. And so that's a shock that pretty much all patent participants in the patent game had, and in some industries more than in others. And I'll send you the cases, but I'm trying to, in the back of my head, I'm at least wondering whether that could help you adjudicate this horse race between sort of the patent race literature and the cost reduction literature.
I'm very jet lagged, so apologize. Some of the data you have is patent data, and you have these panel regressions, which I take it to be yearly data. And I'm wondering, it takes a while to create the patent, to create the technology, and then the patent technology. And so I wonder to what extent these things are matched. Again, jet lag. If you're measuring this innovation by patents, couldn't we say that the patent is exactly the opposite? That is, you had that on your slides later. The patent is a way to prevent other people from using the technology. So yes, the patent shows that you have innovated, but it also shows that you don't want others to use this innovation. I mean, there's always this idea that somebody else could then riff on your patent and do something new, but it has a sort of a two-faced nature to it.
So 2 comments. One was the first comment Holger made. Second comment. So the story you tell is firm A, when it's deciding how much to innovate, will take into account the spillover effects over firm B through common ownership, right? That's not exactly what you take to the data. You simply look at innovation levels. But I wonder whether you could flesh out that story or offer more, at least suggestive evidence to back up your story by doing a combo between the KPSS paper and this great paper in the JFE recently on M&A transactions and common ownership. You may be familiar with it, Mireia. So of course, the nature of the experiment would be to see whether when firm A innovates, so KPSS focus on the returns in connection with the granting of a patent for firm A. But you could look at whether when firm A is granted a patent, firm B, C, D, E, with whom A interacts for common ownership, also experience significant returns in their stock. So that's the way in which those two papers would be comboed into another empirical assessment.
I think both of my points I have already kind of been made by Eric and Emiliano, but 2 points. One thing, this is very similar to Eric's point, which is that you're looking at the cost reduction, but another one, in addition to the patent race, you can also think about is increasing the alphas, increasing the product heterogeneity. So that actually has a very different kind of implications compared to the cost reduction, because when I reduce my cost, I'm kind of stealing business away from my competitors, but when I increase the product differentiation, it actually helps my competitors in many ways, because now they also have more pricing power. So my guess is that if you juxtapose that with a common ownership, now that's going to have a very different kind of implications as far as innovation is concerned. So I think that could be sort of interesting avenue to explore. And then the second point is, this is again very similar to Emiliano's point, What is kind of interesting about this is that I recall that in the original Martin Schmalz's paper, he was looking at the shocks to the ownership part. But in your setting, we can also try to figure out whether or not there's been any shock to the R&D part, right? So imagine that, let's say, one of the firms, I don't know, perhaps goes bankrupt or something, and then there's a shock to that R&D. So, and then sort of try to figure out what the other firm's response is as far as the R&Ds are. And then from that, you can also try to tease out, and then you can sort of condition for the common ownership. So instead of just looking at the shocks on the ownership structure, now we can also dig into the R&D level. So I think that could be another possible identification strategy there.
Okay, I think we have all. We can. It's 5 to 7 minutes.
7 minutes is saying? Okay, let's see. So let's start in order. So thank you very much, everybody, for
Is that how it works? Excellent. Thank you. So Merit, no, the paper doesn't assume that managers innovate less when there's more common ownership, but that's the empirical finding. So I think you're proposing a fine alternative theory or reasons to believe there shouldn't be an effect, but we need that theory doesn't help explain what we see in the data. So on the mechanism, I heard you say that you can't see how the big three would have these influences. But the first thing I want to say is that common ownership is not just driven by the big three. That's what the Amel paper is all about. So I don't know who has started talking about that common ownership is driven by indexing. I know BlackRock did, but I don't think there's any academic study that shows that indexing drives common ownership. Of course it does to some extent, but I'm not sure that this is where most of the variation is. If I have time later, I'll show you a picture of the big three telling firms to stop competing and innovate more. Yeah, if you have time, so we can digest this while I respond to Eric. That's a cool theory. We have to think about this. Thank you. And Holger, we thought about this last night. Totally agree with that. So the spillover is what the patent prevents. So there's some refinements we can do there. And great idea, Emiliano. Stock market reactions to the other firm is fine. That's cool. We can let the spillover effect. And also Albert, just lots of food for thought. What I want to spend a bit more time with is to explain why we use this measure of kappa, this profit weights, and why. So what we want to measure is common ownership in the sense that the extent to which the most influential shareholders in one firm have financial interest in the other. Okay, that's it. Let me say this again. The most influential shareholders in one firm, to which extent do they have financial interest in the other? So for that, we first of all have to measure who the most influential shareholders are, and I'll get back to that. Mireia used the example of Mark Zuckerberg in Facebook. So you say to Facebook and Google, how much common ownership is there? Well, I'd say 0, right? Because Mark Zuckerberg is the influential shareholder in Facebook, has no stakes in Google, and Sergey Brin and Larry Page have lots of, they control Google and have no stakes in Facebook. So common ownership is 0. And kappa measures that. And the reason kappa measures that is, it says, the most influential shareholders, how much financial interest do they have in other firms? The answer is 0, divided by what is the financial interest in the own firm? And that's some positive number, okay? That makes it 0. As opposed to, how much common ownership is there between Delta and United? So say Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett buys stakes in both. So the most influential shareholder in Delta has a large financial interest in United. And the second largest is whatever, BlackRock, Vanguard, whatever. So the next largest, most influential shareholders also have big financial interests in the rival. And that makes for a lot of common ownership. But what you have to realize is this effect comes from the denominator that Johan recommends we should get rid of, right? Because that's where Mark Zuckerberg's holding in Facebook shows up. So these other measures, sorry, I have a super dry mouth. Llewellyn and Lowry and GJL, that's awesome, thank you. And so Giné, Levitt, and all these other measures, they just count the numerator. They say, how much common ownership is there between Facebook and Google? And they say, well, a bunch, because whatever, Facebook and Vanguard and BlackRock hold a lot of shares in both. I think that's bad. I think economically there's no common ownership between these firms. And the reason is just because they miss that the most influential shareholders also have shares in the firms. So I think that's very important. That's much better, thank you. So I think the second problem with these measures is they measure variation where there's none. So if Vanguard increases their stake in Facebook and Google, common ownership goes up in these measures. But I don't think that changes what Facebook or Google do. So I think it's a very bad idea to remove the denominator, and that's why I think the economics literature has really converged on this kappa measure and not the others. And yeah, for that one also has to add block holders. So your comment is very much well taken, because right now we only have the 13 Fs. And much of the literature only has the 13 Fs, the institutional investors. But we don't want to measure common ownership by institutional investors, we want to measure common ownership. And for that, we need the non-institutional investors as well. So that's what we're adding right now as well. In this JPE compensation paper, we did that, and then all the coefficients went up by a factor of 2. We should interpret that as well, I guess, to measure things better. So we think that's very important. So that's what we'll do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I want the conference organizers, ECGI, Suzanne, Elaine. I have bad news and good news. The bad news is that I'm standing between you and reception. The good news is I'm the last thing that stands between you and reception. So I also want to thank the placement of this article immediately after the previous presentation. I think a lot of the synergies are going to be evident on a lot of things. So this is joint work with Ofer, who is in the room, and James Pinnington. So a lot of it has been kind of already mentioned, but really the debate on common ownership has been really something that has been preoccupied both legal and finance scholars over the last 6 to 7 years already. We have seen common ownership rise in concentration, you saw it from the previous presentation, but it really brought about debate whether we should care about it, whether this is a good thing, a bad thing, or should be agnostic altogether. On the negative side, Martin and other authors have really raised concerns about the potential anti-competitive effects of product market aspects. And there are some signs for some positive signs, right? So the innovation spillover will offer and register and so on. How does common ownership really impact firm behavior? I think that's a really key question that this paper and some other projects are trying to nail down. And it stems from the understanding that in the United States at least, shareholders don't really impact firm behavior directly, right? They don't really actively tell investors, institutional investors don't really tell management how to act. They're relatively passive, and there's a bunch of studies here that talk about it. There are some recent studies that show potential avenue for influence, which is through executive compensation, right? If you set incentives for management, how they're going to get compensated, that can impact the way they design or operate their firms. The problem with existing literature, right, it's not clear if this is driven by passive, active investors. And ultimately, beside management, whoever is in charge of setting firm behavior is the board and not shareholders, right? Shareholders elect the board once a year. There's also a question how much choice they have in the board nomination, and so on and so forth. So this project really tries to put the spotlight on that process of director elections, right? So directors really are in charge on firm's behavior, setting management incentives. Key strategic decisions of the company are put in front of the board. And even more importantly, shareholders, that's the key avenue they have on influencing behavior by electing or not electing specific directors, right? important factor that this project also highlights, we already have evidence on director interlocks, including interlocks of firms that are operating in the same space. I've written about it, Ofer has written about it. So we have that descriptive knowledge of the fact that we have directors that are serving companies on the same industry. And we also know that directors are really good conduit for transfer of knowledge and practices, right? There is literature in the legal space on the transfer of corporate governance practices between firms through directors. So there's room to think that directors can help enable collaboration between companies that are also on strategic decisions. So what are the main findings that we find in this paper? Using a sample of all public firms for roughly 20 years, we find that firms, 40% of the firms have shared the director in the same industry at least for 1 year in our sample. We also find, and I'll talk about the digital measure, but we found that the increase in the measure that we are using that is a little bit different than the measure that was used in another paper, is associated with higher likelihood of firms sharing a common director. The likelihood of sharing a common director is stronger when the investors are larger, when they are more concentrated, and have lower turnover. All of those are indications that they have more investment in what's going on in their firm, and also specifically activist hedge funds. We find, and this is going back to the discussion we just had, that they actually know, we find no association specifically between the big three and the likelihood of appointment of common directors. So the results are driven by other common investors. And we find that the results, even though are driven a lot by hedge funds, they are not solely driven by hedge funds. We find that they still hold for a non-hedge fund common owner. And again, they are more statistically significant for larger, more concentrated, and longer investment horizon types of investors. So let's give a more of an example of how this channel might work. This is a hedge fund example. So we have Baker Brothers hedge fund that is holding shares in this biotech company, Sang Yop Kang, had in 2012 35%, 2013 34%. What has changed? There's a different company, Acadia, that in 2012 Baker Brothers has 10%. They are part of a bunch of investors who have significantly large stakes, but then they doubled their size in 2013 to 21%, becoming the biggest owner in Acadia. And what we see in the data is that the following year, we have this director that has served in Senegal, Dr. Stephen Bigger, who is a partner of Baker Brothers, and is being appointed to the board in 2014 of Acadia. That's not, people who have done work in the hedge fund activism space know this is a common way through which hedge funds are influencing companies by appointing director, putting the director on the board, channeling information into the boardroom and trying to influence how companies are operating. So a little bit about the data. So we have a panel data of film period observations for, as I said, 20 years. We use both SSC3 classification and the Hobick-Phillips classification that tries to nail competition a little bit more nuanced way through firms' disclosure of what they do. The data on director appointment is sourced from Vortex. The data on institutional shareholders from certain filings. And basically, we have this director variable that basically measures the service of a director on two firms in a given year. The digital method. So similar but a little bit different than Kappa. Basically what we're trying to measure in very simple terms is what is the shareholding of an investor in a specific company and how much is the shareholding in that company as far as the entire portfolio of investment that an investor has. The logic here is that if you have, you can have a large investment in one company, but that investment overall is very minimal across your portfolio, but you can also have a little bit slower investment in one company, but that investment represents a larger stake in your entire investment portfolio, so you care more about that investment compared to a different investor. And this is basically average on the pair level, so we take both investment in both companies and average out into one figure. Some summary statistics, right? So we have quite a bit number of year observations, and as you can see, 40% based on Hobick-Phillips, 30%, 37% if we use the input. So this is similar to the graph you just saw, the rise in common ownership. The only thing that we're adding here is the also rise of the likelihood of having directors serving on two companies at the same time. The director interlocks are kind of matching nicely with the rise in common ownership. So one interesting data point here. There are two big industries that really take a big chunk of the likelihood of serving on sharing a director. Drugs and computer data processing and services, you can see, have the largest, by wide margin, likelihood of CDs, which is common directors, and the rest of the sample is much lower. I can tell you that we ran the data without those two, and the results still have a bit less pronounced, but they are still evident there, which is interesting. Okay, so we ran regressions. First regression I want to show you is kind of the probability of sharing common director with a rise in the digital index. The first column here is just the year fixed effects, and we see pretty strong effect, but it also holds when we have our more strictest classification. We have both year fixed effects and period effects. It's a 4% increase, but the unconditional likelihood of serving on as a common director is only 0.37, so it is still significant from an economic perspective. You can see here a dynamic plot of the likelihood of directors serving on two companies relatively to the addition of common owners. So we can see this as another support to that hypothesis. So one of the key, I think, contribution of this paper is really taking the common ownership landscape and trying to typologize it based on the type of investor, right? So we basically try to look at different types of common owners and see what is driving the result, right? So we look at the big three, we look at the differentiation between large and small investors as far as their asset under management. We look at the turnover, so the churn rate, how likely they are to replace their investment in company X with company Y. Obviously, if you're a longer-term investor, you have more incentive to try to influence company's behavior and more incentive to try to appoint a director. If you're there only for 6 months a year, by the time you appoint a director, that's not going to be relevant anymore for your consideration. High versus loss concentration, how much you're concentrated in one company versus distributed across companies. And we divided between activist hedge funds and the rest of the universe and used the data that was used in the Barab et al. Paper. So first of all, big three versus not big three. As I told you, we find no statistically significant impact of the big three on the likelihood of sharing a common director, but we do find the statistical results for anybody other than the big three. That is also with fair and fair expense. How about size? Okay, so larger, much more pronounced effect of large investors in the likelihood of the digital increase, 31 versus 12. As far as churn, you can see 21 for high churn, 28 for low churn, so favorable for companies, for investors that are more long term. And as far as concentration, again, for investors that are more concentrated, the effect is larger compared to investors that are not as concentrated. As I said, we also looked at the fact that the hedge funds drive a lot of the results, and even when we include the hedge fund as part of the equation, we see that the results still hold. So investors that are larger, that are more long-term, less churn, and with higher concentration in those companies all yield stronger results compared to the alternatives. So what can we take from this project so far, right? So we find this robust association between common directors and common ownership. Again, this is an important active channel, potential active channel of influence, right? So you can, that's one of the tools shareholders have in influencing corporate behavior is by the appointment of directors, and that is something that might be help explain how this transmission of common owners' wills into company behavior might happen. We saw that the results are driven by hedge funds, but not only, but also by large, long-term concentrated investors, but not the big three, right? And as Martin has alluded to, automatically, once the literature started to highlight the common ownership debate, there was a lot of attention to the role of Big 3 in potential creating that issue. And again, we don't find that that's the case. What are we going to try to do next? We're going to try to look a little bit about the welfare effects. So right now the paper is somewhat agnostic about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. We're going to try to see whether there are welfare effects that we can identify. And we are trying to find more anecdotal color to our case study. So we're going to try to find more, flesh out more examples to kind of help explain how non-activist hedge funds are actually doing that. So with that, thank you very much.
All right. Well, last session, Saturday, I am reminded by the words of Prince, dearly beloved, let us get through this thing called life. I've heard the jet lag comments, but that is no excuse. I know your body batteries might be running low, but we have to thank ECGI and SNU for one of the most fantastic experiences gathering this amazing group in such an amazing place where we've really seen the excellence of the faculty here, and we've learned so much as well about the local scene. So bring it. We are, professors, Yaron and Ofer here that are sharing their great work, so we want to also deliver it to you. And so I have a GCGC riddle for the group. What do you get when you have law professor authors and law professor commentary? An interdisciplinary finance paper session. So keep that in mind. I am a law professor, so I'm going to give some law professor commentary, and then we'll turn to Q&A and also enliven the interdisciplinary effect. Okay, so also, I'll say I would consider myself a friend of Ofer and Yaron, though I am perhaps a skeptic of common ownership literature generally, and I haven't written in the space. But when I came to Seoul, and we had this wonderful ESG conference beforehand that some of us had got to attend, and we were hosted also for a dinner at the National Museum of Korea, and I discovered that some of the great statues, national treasures, sit in the same pose that I do when I try to read a paper like this and give commentary, which is the pensive bodhisattva in the quiet room of contemplation. It is in this spirit that I give to you these comments. Okay, so summary claims. I was glad to see that my homework matched up with what you said, though I like to use the actual words of the authors when I do this, because in fact it is that I'm dealing with in the paper and commenting on. So you say, this is a mechanism paper. And specifically you say, this paper proposes one such mechanism, overlap in the boards of directors of competing firms. And then you go on to explain the key things, which was also matching up with the slides that Yaron just showed about what you're doing with the data and the more detailed results that is particularly strong for institutions with lower portfolio turnover and longer investment horizons, little relationship using common ownership by the Big 3. Institutions' investment horizons seem to matter significantly for director appointments, except for hedge fund investors. And then you say, this suggests that the common ownership by highly concentrated investors that predicts common director appointments is to a large extent based on ownership by hedge fund investors. So those were the key points that I was taking out as a summary of the claims. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I think this is really quite an interesting paper, and so I've been a skeptic mostly because of the mechanism. I've always been so confused about this. So I think one of the greatest things about this paper is that it's contributing to the most important question in my view, or at least addressing the skeptics about what is this mechanism. Is there a mechanism through which common owners affect corporate strategy or managerial behavior? And so this paper and topic deserves attention and further investigation. Here I'm going to later add some fire emojis, because when I say further investigation, I don't know when I read this paper if you mean, just other researchers, or actually if this deserves further investigation. I'm a law professor. So I'll have three main suggestions for you. I'm not the person to give a commentary, the comment ownership in research methodology or research design. I did hear some difference between the approaches, and I think that there's quite a bit to be said about that. But I'm going to focus on the law professor view of this paper. One, I'm going to suggest that you might clarify the claim mechanism, as it's claiming it's a mechanism paper, but it still wasn't quite clear to me. And then I think you might clarify, maybe avoid, I can't tell, any claims of causality or if you're asserting a causal link. And then third, I want to suggest that you dig into the industries and provide some examples. So I heard you just say that that's one of your next steps. Great. Okay, so suggestion one. The paper says it's a mechanism paper, and it says it's proposing the mechanism that the overlap in the board of directors of competing firms is the mechanism. But the paper, amazingly, is only 18 pages long plus the tables. So if any of you have not read it yet, it's actually quite a short read. And on that, you're being kind to your readers, but I actually think you could tell us much more. And I checked out, again, some of the other common ownership papers, and they use more pages. So I think you've got room to add, and you've got enthusiastic, pensive readers that are willing to do it. So first I wondered, what is the mechanism by which the investors affect the interlocking directors? I think you could explain, step by step, how the proposed mechanism works as a matter of corporate law and governance, and I'll have a bit more to say on this. And then what? And then it's supposed to get all the way down to understanding that this would affect corporate strategy or managerial behavior. I understand that in this paper you're trying to set aside any commentary on the welfare effects, whether it's positive or negative, but still you're asserting, it seems, that it is a mechanism paper. So there would have to be some explanation in my mind so that I would really see that mechanism of how it's affecting the interlocking directors, and then how you get to this being part of the common ownership literature, in a sense. And then, what direction does this go? And once I started really thinking about it, I think it's a mechanism, but I wasn't really sure if anything is happening here besides a key finding that you have. So I'll say more on this with suggestion two. So this is just an overview of the things that I think you could do to clarify the mechanism for mechanism papers. Then finally, you might add something about what might else be explaining the findings that you have. This is related to the causality and the direction. Okay, so I said I'd give you more on corporate law and governance. I think you should embrace your inner law professors. I know it's a finance paper, but look at the authors. So you say, the appointment of directors is often the only way shareholders can exert influence on firms. I think you could be more precise. We've had actually 2 days where we've talked about lots of different ways that isn't actually about the appointment of directors. And I know you guys know this. While appealing, this is where you're talking about the Anton, Ederer, Giné, and Martin paper. And this is not the paper that was just presented, but it's the productivity of this group is, ambitious and encouraging. So they have a different paper that I've read. I had seen it come across the transom on the ECGI or SSRN. And what I remembered about the paper, the new paper on executive compensation, was that, to my mind, what I remembered was that it was passive, the mechanism. And when I went back and I looked at the paper, my understanding is that, yes, that paper is suggesting that it could be, that it's a passive. And so the way you're characterizing that other paper that's also a mechanism paper says, while appealing, the author's mechanism may be incomplete because in practice, the board of directors sets compensation without clear input from investors. So I have a couple questions on that part to clarify, because one, I think, I don't know if you could say that more precisely, because actually, investors do participate in executive compensation, whether that's behind the scenes dialogue or say on pay. So as a matter of corporate law and governance, I think that could be a bit more precise. But then I also thought, it might have, for those that haven't read the Anton et al. Paper, I wondered if it would give them the right idea of what that paper actually says. And then here's the one where I did the cartoon. I was like in the pensive bodhisattva, but then I did like circled something, which was, you're describing what you're finding and how you're finding it in the data. You had about 2 decades, it was lots of music. And you say that, first there's little evidence of a pre-trend in director interlocks in the years preceding common ownership increases. That was really interesting to me, and you had my attention. And then you said, but then you're finding that that there wasn't a pre-trend, but the effect that you're finding appears immediate and permanent. And so I circled the word immediate because it just didn't make sense to me, because if what you're measuring is appointment of board directors, I don't see how it could be immediate. And that made me wonder, that's what made me wonder about what was actually going on, because I don't know when the investments are made, and when the annual meetings are, and when you would have these directors, but it could potentially be a year as a matter of corporate law and governance before you'd actually have the appointment. So I wasn't sure how it could be immediate, and I think that you could just clarify that, because that's really interesting. Okay, so suggestion 2, I don't know what I'm actually suggesting, if I'm suggesting that you clarify it or avoid it, but I wondered what you were saying about causality. And there's some different language that made me wonder about that. Like you said, the findings show that institutions may affect board appointments, calls for further investigation of the type of owners that drive these results. Which made me wonder if you're suggesting that they're doing, that it's an active mechanism. And then you're using words like it increases, and that is not associated with, doesn't suggest causality to me, but with an increase in common directors, and the baseline result is driven by the non-big 3. So here we see more language that I think is suggesting some kind of causality, but I wasn't sure. And then when I put it together with that immediate language, I really wasn't sure what's going on, because I wondered, could some of the investors actually just be attracted by seeing a director with industry experience and then invest, if it's immediate? And when I saw that table 2, that's when I thought, maybe that's what they'd be doing, because you seem to be finding this more in drug and tech industries, where maybe actually industry expertise would be valuable. So there's just a minor thing, and I wasn't sure what you were doing when you said the measures based on size, turnover, concentration, and hedge fund classification exclude holdings by the big 3, and I wasn't sure why there you were excluding the big 3. So I think the big picture here is just, if you mean to be suggesting causality, you can make that clear what the causal link is. And if not, then you might look at some language to make sure you're saying it's not causal. Okay, so here's the 3rd suggestion. This is where I was trying to piece it together. About when I got to this table 2, I was looking at what seems to be the big areas. And we have drugs, computer and data processing services, electronic components and accessories, and medical instruments and supplies. And so if you put those together, it sounds like drug and tech. But that's where I started to wonder. That's when I remembered, oh, I'm a law professor. And, and I've been seeing a lot about this. I actually teach M&A. I was mostly a Silicon Valley corporate lawyer, but I did a little bit of antitrust. So I started to think, can you be more specific about that? Because it seems like this paper might be that you do have a very interesting finding, and you have an attractive title. And given that there's a fair bit of attention in this space, people might really grab onto this paper. And if they do grab onto your paper, which I'm assuming you want, it would be useful if this was more specific about where are you pointing a finger and where should they be looking? What is this with the industry classification? I know the paper just before didn't use the industry classification. This goes to 3 digits. Could you be more specific? So when I was thinking about what's been going on, like putting it into the legal context, so the DOJ has been really busy in the space of interlocking directorates. They've been putting out things. This came out in March. And when you look at the announcement about what they've been cracking down on interlocking directorates, it's drug and tech companies, and then also an insurance and airline. So it's feeling like, And so emojis, if you ever text with me, you know that is rare. There's a lot of hearts and things, but a fire emoji is rare. But that's why I felt I would give it to you to consider. Do you mean to be putting a fire emoji on this? Because Section 8 of the Clayton Act prohibits, there's some limited safe harbor exceptions, but it prohibits a person from being a director or board-appointed officer of 2 or more corporations that are engaged in U.S. commerce that are competitors. I remember going back to one of my early slides, the way what you said this mechanism is about competitors. So when we're law professors, we know we got to be careful about that. And then I looked again. I don't know that you're saying that at all because you say, the way you're using the word competitors isn't pointing a finger. It says, if a pair of firms share an SIC3 code for at least 1 year between 2000 and 2019, we mark them as competitors, and we refer to this sample as the SIC3 universe. But there is actually legal definitions of what it is to be competitors, and since these papers have been getting so much attention, I think you might just consider that. Do you mean to be doing that? Could you be more precise? Because, for those of you who don't remember your Clayton Act, it's per se illegal. That's the thing about this Section 8, is it's per se illegal, which means, for the non-lawyers, that you don't have to have anti-competitive effects or injury to have liability. So you could separately have like Section 1 liability independently or enforcement, but the way that Section 8 works is different. And also the FTC Act also has Section 5, which can go even broader. And historically, the government challenges to interlocking directorates has been very rare, and it's almost always been in the context of merger review, and there's been very limited exceptions to that until recently. I think many might be aware of the exception that we've had, which was the situation in 2009 when Eric Schmidt from Google resigned from Apple's board, and Arthur Levinson, who was a biotech executive from Apple, resigned from Google's board. So there have been these types of situations, but it was limited until now. There's been a lot of activity. So in April 2002, the DOJ Assistant Attorney General Cantor said that they were going to ramp up their efforts to identify violations across the broader economy, and they're not going to hesitate to bring these Section 8 cases. And then in October, this past October, the DOJ announced 7 directors resigned from their board positions at 5 public companies. Most of them were tech companies, in response to DOJ concerns about the interlocking directorates. And 3 of the directors represented private equity firms. So it seems like the DOJ has in its sights a fair bit of tech companies and private equity folks. And then the next month, the FTC, because in the US we have this odd situation with the FTC and DOJ sharing regulatory authority over antitrust. They released a new section, Section 5 policy statement that overrode their past statement. And they said that identifying interlocking directorates that fall outside the literal language of the Clayton Act is right for Section 5. So basically you've got signals from the DOJ saying we're turning up the heat, and the FTC says, yeah, and we get to cover even more. And then you've got the politicians. Dick Durbin wrote this letter to the DOJ and the FTC asking them to investigate the life science industry, and what he said in the letter was all about the drug companies. And then this past March, we had more action with 5 directors resigning from 4 public company boards. There was a private equity firm that, in response to the DOJ enforcement action, declined to use their board appointment rights. And then Cantor, at the ABA spring antitrust meeting a couple months ago, said they now have a vibrant Section 8 enforcement approach and nearly 20 open investigations with many additional opportunities. So I don't know that this is even so relevant to your paper, except that that's the context in which the paper is coming. So I think it would be good to clarify. So in conclusion, I think the key thing that you have is an extremely interesting finding, which is that you found that the frequency of director interlocks and the average level of common ownership are steadily increasing in an association. I think that is so interesting. I'm really curious to learn more about what's going on. And my suggestions are mostly in the vein of I think you could clarify the mechanism and whether there's causality, and getting a bit more specific maybe about the relevant industries and examples. Thank you so much.
Thanks a little bit both for the comments and for keeping the crowd energetic and, you know, just before the fall of like after the conference. But so just a couple of quick comments. So first of all, I'll start on your last point because all of the things that you said I totally agree. I had a paper, that's the paper I wrote in 2019 about the antitrust implications of common directors, which is the springboard of this paper. So I actually spoke to the DOJ a little bit after the paper, and you know, the recent actions by the DOJ and the FTC are hopefully a byproduct of that research. So those of you who don't know, as Elizabeth said, you know, people didn't really believe that, you know, common directors were serving potential competitors when they started to look into that, and you know, I'm glad this is becoming something that people are really paying attention to. As far as causality, I didn't really highlight it, but we're doing lagged effect. So we are looking. You're right. It's not that, you know, the director appointment needs to happen a little bit after the rise in common ownership. So we have a 1-year lag between the rising the industry in the common ownership metric and the appointment of director. So that some of the addresses that concern. Totally agree about the fact that it's mainly drag and take. That's something that we need to dig more into, and that's something we're trying to do right now. Is basically we are with the team of our age, we are manually looking at all of the cases that we have, trying to kind of like create a database that has kind of like examples to try to flesh it out a little bit more. So that's something that is we're working on. So I want to take more questions. So I'm just going to do this stage.
Just add one more point to this. Okay, so two quick points. One of the competing firms, it's just a drag from previous. I don't think it's in the current version, it may have been an older version. The immediate effect, one of the things that happens in some of the examples that we looked at is that it's not really elections. Often these board appointments are actually just the board appoints, fills in a vacancy. And then, as in the example that Yaron showed, when you have a new investor coming in, like in the Baker Brothers, they can coordinate it right away as they make the investment, right? So it's possible that much of the effect is coming from that, and that can potentially explain the figure. One thing about the welfare effect, this is just a side comment. We did look at a bunch of things. We need to do more analysis. But this is actually an example where you do the analysis at the firm level and you do the analysis at the pair level, often you get different results. And that's partly what I'm in the process of trying to figure out. So, so that's partly why we're still holding back on making claims that that's in this regard. So.
This is great to have these two papers in succession because I can ask my question to Ofer and to Yaron and to Martin and to Mireia at the same time. It's about the data of the common ownership, and Martin said it in the discussion, was mine up there, it's not just the big three, and you were breaking this down, Yaron and Ofer. And so that made me wonder, if you decompose the common ownership, for example, the trend line that you had, I understand it's not additive, so it's a bit more complicated, but if you were to decompose it, like in the trend line, also the variation from year to year, how much of it comes from the various types of investors that you have? I mean, that's sort of leading to what I guess you will eventually do, which is to look at what are the effects of these common owners and the common directorships, but even just to like get a ballpark, like a sense of how plausible is it that those hedge funds, for example, could be driving the results of the common ownership literature. And maybe Martin, Mireia, you've done that. I don't know. I'm just curious about that.
Yes, just 3 very quick points. I really liked the way Elizabeth brought out that mechanism for how you're transmitting from shareholders to directors, and I actually just sent through a paper to Mireia that I once wrote through a corporate governance lens on common ownership, because I felt that at least one branch of common ownership, and basically the INA Eldar, really doesn't look at that and assumes, and I call it the mind reading model, that management just knows what shareholders want, and so there's nothing being transmitted. And I think that's really, a matter for concern. I also wonder about the rise of fully independent nomination committees. I mean, maybe these areas that Elizabeth's talking about, they're looking around for, we need expertise in the drug industry. Oh, these people know what they're talking about. So maybe it's coming from nomination committees rather than from shareholders. And then I also thought it was very interesting, I was not aware of that statutory prohibition in the US on competing directors. And it made me think in the UK, you would think that that amounted to an impermissible conflict of interest. But in UK law, it's okay to be a competing director as long as you don't disclose confidential information.
Yeah, so first answer to this question. You can't really answer that question with that data set, what drives common ownership, because you'd have to have data on all owners. So, and the problem is for that you have to merge together all of the ownership files of the SEC, the 13F records and the Form 4s and all that, and that's a huge pain, and that's why nobody's done it. Except I spent the last 7 years of my life doing that, and that's what this Ederer paper does. But now nobody has any excuses anymore to not use it or invent data, because it's online. Ownershipproject.com, you can just download this stuff and look at it.
It's true, he gave it to me.
That's good stuff. Oh, it worked. Our form works. That's great. Okay, so so the answer to your question is, it is activist hedge funds that positively contribute to common ownership. Weirdly enough, that was the biggest surprise for me. So, for example, Pershing Square holds shares in Domino's Pizza, Burger King, and Chipotle's, but they only file a 13E in one of them. So if you only analyze 13Es, you would think, okay, they only hold a share in one of the firms in the industry. But if you have an influence in one firm, but you also have a financial interest in the other, that is the definition of common ownership. You don't have to influence both of them. So activists positively influence common ownership. Non-financial blockholders, in some industries they do, but not usually. Usually they have a negative effect, right? You think whatever, Jeff Bezos or whoever holds a stake in Amazon, but not in whoever the competitor of Amazon is. Insider holdings depress it, right? So a manager tends to hold a chunk in one firm, but not in the others. That's a short answer, we can talk more about that. Indexing contributes positively to common ownership, but not alone. Also, big three ownership contributes positively to common ownership over and above indexing. And I think that's very, very important because, right, people say BlackRock is an index fund. No, BlackRock is not an index fund. BlackRock is an asset management company that centralizes corporate control across all its active and passive funds. So it's really, I think, one of the elephants in the room is to which extent the centralization of corporate control across the funds is what drives, this concentration of power and common ownership. And nobody's researched that, because for that you would need the fund level finance, and nobody has done that exercise. So whoever says that index funds drive common ownership, that's just not a thing. Or we don't know to which extent it is a thing. Okay, so that's the answer for this question. I also have a question, but I guess I'm running out of time.
Okay, Johan.
Thank you for your great paper. So your paper identified the mechanism or the channel through which the common ownership may affect the managerial behaviors, and these managerial behaviors may include positively the information spillover or negatively the anti-competitive activities. But can one body seat be such a channel, really such a channel? I mean, the interlocking director is bound by the confidentiality obligation and fiduciary obligation to each company that they serve. So under these obligations, how can technological information be spilled over to other company, and how can the anti-competitive activity take place? So are we assuming that they may breach these kind of obligations, or do we need to modify or reduce the level of confidentiality obligation or fiduciary obligation in the context of the common ownership? So it's sorry for the too much law professor-like comment.
So my question is almost the mirror image of the previous question. As I was kind of thinking about the, let's say the welfare implications of these interlocking directors, I was wondering, I mean, especially given that a lot of this is being driven by hedge funds, small hedge funds, what exactly is the additional kick they get from having the same guy sit on two companies, as opposed to, suppose I just have taken some shares of A and B, so I have two possibilities. I can assign Director X on A and Director Y on B, and then I may still be able to, still breach fiduciary duty, extract all these different kinds of information, sort of try to coordinate the activities between A and B, or I can decide to assign X on A and X on B, right, the same guy. I'd be really curious as to know what's the additional kick I get, setting aside maybe the antitrust implications. And then, I don't know, maybe if you do firm returns or, whatever the other measures are, I think that could be a sort of really interesting question.
So it was interesting to see that much of the action seems to come from pharma, because pharma is kind of a unique industry. So many pharma companies are one-trick ponies that specialize in this particular designer drug, which doesn't necessarily overlap with the drug of this other firm, even though the two firms may have an overlapping director. So I wonder whether your measurement of industries, even if you're looking at the three-level SIC code or at the Harvard Phillips measurement or whatever, whether that's still way over relative to the definition of competition. I wouldn't be saying this necessarily, most of the action didn't come from pharma, but pharma is quite unique.
In a way, my question's already been, my comment, but I'm saying this not only as an academic, but also as someone who chairs a nomination committee of a big company. And from my perspective, wearing my director cap, the issue is much less about the kind of antitrust issues, much more about conflicts of interest, confidentiality, and fiduciary duty as well. And the other point I would make is that sort of when it comes to independent directors, you're also having to navigate through different definitions of what independence is, and if it's independence from a large shareholder, depending on how large is defined, you've got to deal with that. But if it comes to a shareholder nominating a director, if they've got enough influence just to be nominating a director, there's a limited role for the nomination committee to play in relation to that.
Yeah, I wanted to what extent it would be, sorry, to what extent it would be interesting to, if you could tell us a bit more about how directors are selected both in the US and also in the various industries, because in markets I know better, directors are not only not necessarily pushed by investors, which I think is the mechanism you have in mind, but they also select them among themselves. There's a lot of cooptation. So this actually would trump your mechanism because they come from another source, and this would explain the interlocking effect. Basically, it's a small network, it's a small cabal, and yeah, of course they are in various companies because it's a small group. And the other element I had in mind, which is related, I didn't see whether you really focus on independent directors, because one might also imagine that one is an executive director in the company and a non-executive director in another, and especially in France, there is a lot of this sort of interlocking mechanism.
Quickly, kind of piling on Junhyung and Albert and Eilish's questions. I'm kind of wondering whether a common director isn't a small necklace of kryptonite for a shareholder who wants to coordinate activities between two potential competitors, and that shareholder is still below the conventional margin that they would be considered to be a dominant shareholder under Delaware law, right? So if I own if I own a chunk of two companies, and I'm thinking, should I put Ofer and Yaron on each of the two companies and just give them instructions? That's pretty good, right? They can just be sort of taking my marching orders. But if I put Ofer on both boards, is he likely to have to recuse himself at one or both of those companies? And that's kind of messed up. Like, why would I want that to happen? I mean, there might be, one thing you could track down is whether maybe there are various types of fiduciary duty waivers at some of these companies, where they're like a corporate opportunity waiver type thing. That'll get some of it. I don't know how much of it it'll get, but there's almost a sense in which, the corporate lawyer side, it's like, wow, this is kind of a, I'm creating obstacles for myself rather than easing myself down the road.
Okay, all right, I have the mic, so that is it. So it's a question, I think, to everybody in the room. So I'm a bit puzzled by the commentary by many that the mechanism is unclear by which common ownership could affect firm behavior and market outcomes. So most components of that view seem to think that common ownership is driven by the big three, and the big three are largely passive, so what could possibly be the mechanism? But the whole point of this other paper we have in the Journal of Political Economy is that exactly this passivity is a mechanism that can rationalize all of the results in this literature. So if you believe that common owners are all passive, then I don't understand what the puzzle is. And then there's this paper by Nathan Shikita that has 45 pages of active interventions by common owners in all dimensions, voice and pay and voting. And so, for example, the pay results we have in this JPE paper, right? And this could also be a passive mechanism, or it could be active. Then there's voting and proxy contests, right? So the common owners voting against hedge funds that want to strengthen competition. So we know that happens. Then we just saw the DOJ started enforcing Sherman Act Section 8, so we know there are violations there. It's puzzling to me what's unclear about how having a director on competing companies' boards has a possibility. I mean, yes, there's legal questions about the possibilities of doing. Well, then voice, we showed you this slide of BlackRock talking to the pharma companies, asking them literally to compete, not compete, but share patents with each other. I mean, they literally asked them. I don't understand what the open questions are. And so it's a genuine question, because I think I want to know where the open questions are for future research and what kind of evidence people want to see that would actually move their prior. So if there's any evidence you would like to see, I would be very curious to hear what that potential evidence would be. Isn't there already? Is really a question for everyone.
Okay, probably the last question.
No pressure. So I'm actually very curious, right? Because I don't see any outcomes here. We won't talk about welfare, but there's no outcome. So if you are saying that this mechanism is important, I actually want to see some outcomes in the sense that, I mean, going back to your point about, how important is this common directors in the grand scheme of common ownership, like Martin was saying. Is this the mechanism, or are there many other more mechanisms that are either at least equally important or more important than common directors? And at the very least, I would like to see some evidence that common directors is an important mechanism to influence outcome, particularly in the pharma industry. And this actually related to the JFE paper that I pointed out earlier during my discussion. JFE paper doesn't look at public firms, it looks at private firms and look at the venture capitalists sitting on boards of these private firms. And now I'm hearing it sounds to me that this is very similar, except that this is being played in small publicly listed firms versus in private firms, right? So I think this is an important mechanism. I want to see more evidence of it.
Okay, so well, there's like some questions or comments, and you can use 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay, I'll start, and I'm sure Ofer will have some stuff to say too. But first of all, that's great. Thank you, everybody. And I think it's great that it evokes questions, because that's the goal. But I would say to a lot of the comments on kind of like the process of electing director and how this can happen. So Albert, your point is well taken. I think it's if anything, it underestimates our results, right? So if what we are pitching is just the cases where you actually put the same person on, there's potentially a whole, even larger set of cases where the common owners actually have two different and that's what we're trying to do in trying to kind of like look at the anecdotal examples and see kind of what happens. I would say two things. First of all, the attention to common director is recent, right? So our sample is up to 2019. Like my paper is 2019. The DOJ is just now starting to pay attention. You can potentially come back in 7 years. You can go back and check it, and I wouldn't be surprised if there will be a significant change in how things are operating in that plan. And I would say both to Genevieve and some of the other questions, you can also say there's often different ways in which this can happen, right? So there's the example we gave with the hedge fund. Hedge funds are often teeny run, so they have to put the same partner in the same board companies, because if they put their own nominee, it's going to be one of the 3 people that run the hedge fund. So that's one reason why you're going to have the same person, and why you're going to actively negotiate, either immediately negotiate to put that director in, or in the next annual meeting they're going to be recommended by the nominating committee to be join the board. As you guys were thinking, and Ofer and I just talked about it a lot, trying to figure out how is this going to happen. But it could be a scenario where the motivating impetus is from that the directors wanting to appoint somebody they know, or somebody that works in the same industry, but there's some risk to doing that. And the presence of a common director, so a common owner, might alleviate the concern, or like at least they will say, well, we can see the benefit of that happen. We're willing to take the risk of having this common director because we have the upside, which might be less likely when you have a lot of the rest of investors that don't want to take that risk. So that's something else that potentially could be going on. Totally agree on the corporate opportunity waiver and fiduciary duties. I think a lot of, especially in drugs, there's a lot of directors that get, VC directors that basically serve in those companies. It's kind of like understood that they can do that. They have like blank waiver. So although theoretically you have fiduciary duties, in reality I don't think that's really going to be impacting. And again, it goes back to Martin's point. How, when you have a director on the board, how is that exactly impacting decisions of the company? So you can say, well, management now have an incentive to pollute it to the extent that it benefits them, and the board is going to be more silent or not. So those are things that we don't really dive into in this paper, but I think are really great topics to continue to explore, either in some of it in this paper, but some of it in follow-up papers. Hopefully we can find your one. I don't have much time, and I want to offer some time to respond to anything else.
Maybe just one quick comment, which is maybe just to Martin. This paper is not trying to substitute passive channel. That's a separate debate, and it's a separate literature. We're trying to highlight that there may be potentially an active channel. And I know some people mentioned the VC context. So I have a paper that will appear in the RFS, which is exactly about the VC channel. So in the VC channel, that's it's very easy to believe the idea, right, that they're directors. So that's why this is kind of more provocative, or and why we're still trying to figure out what is actually going on in public firms, especially as far as the active channel is concerned, right? So, but thank you.